The recording was perfect, crystal clear. December 11, 1990, FBI listening post, Brooklyn Federal Building. Agent Bruce Mao adjusted his headphones as John Gotti's voice filled the surveillance room. Not the public Gotti, the one who smiled for cameras and wore $1,000 suits. This was the private Gotti, unguarded, frustrated, talking about the man sitting 3 floors below in federal custody. "Sammy's a rat, he's gonna do me." Gotti's voice carried through the sophisticated recording equipment. "This is gonna be a cosa nostra till I die, be it an hour from now, or be it tonight, or 100 years from now when I'm in jail." The irony was absolute. In that moment, John Gotti was predicting his own future with mathematical precision. What he didn't understand was that the federal government had learned something about loyalty that the streets never taught. It could be purchased, leveraged, and turned into the very weapon that would destroy him. 3 floors down, Salvatore Gravano sat in his cell, calculating. Not revenge or escape or defiance, mathematics, the kind of cold arithmetic that had kept him alive through 19 murders and 15 years in the Gambino crime family. The numbers were simple. Cooperation meant 5 years in prison. Loyalty meant dying behind bars. This was December 1990. By April 1992, one of these men would be free. The other would be serving life without parole. The difference wasn't courage or honor or strength, it was understanding what loyalty was worth in a system designed to make it worthless. To understand how the federal government destroyed John Gotti, you need to understand what they learned from failing to destroy him 3 times. Between 1985 and 1990, Gotti beat 3 federal prosecutions, not through superior legal strategy or procedural technicalities, through something older and more powerful, the absolute refusal of his people to testify against him. Federal prosecutors had evidence. They had surveillance, financial records, witness statements. What they didn't have was someone inside the organization willing to explain what that evidence meant, to connect the dots between conversations and crimes, to provide the narrative that turns scattered facts into compelling convictions. The traditional approach to organized crime prosecutions was archaeological. Build cases piece by piece, document by document, hoping to accumulate enough evidence to prove specific crimes. But sophisticated criminal organizations had learned to operate around this approach. They used codes, intermediaries, and most importantly, they cultivated loyalty so absolute that members would accept life sentences rather than betray the group. By 1990, federal law enforcement had learned to think anthropologically instead of archaeologically. They studied organized crime like social scientists studying tribal cultures. They identified the values that held these groups together: honor, respect, loyalty, omerta. Then they systematically corrupted those values. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970, gave prosecutors the tools. But it took 20 years to learn how to use those tools not just to prosecute crimes, but to dismantle the cultural foundations that made organized crime possible. The key insight was elegant. Every criminal organization was only as strong as its members' commitment to the group, and that commitment could be purchased. Salvatore Gravano understood commitment differently than John Gotti. Where Gotti saw loyalty as an absolute moral principle, Gravano saw it as a practical arrangement based on mutual benefit. This difference had made their partnership successful for 6 years. Gotti provided leadership, charisma, and the respect that comes from never backing down. Gravano provided operational expertise, business discipline, and the willingness to eliminate problems permanently. But by 1990, their different approaches to loyalty had become a fatal liability. Gotti believed that maintaining traditional organized crime values was more important than avoiding federal prosecution. Gravano believed that survival was more important than symbolism. When federal pressure made those philosophies incompatible, their partnership was doomed. The FBI's surveillance operation above the Ravenite Social Club captured this deterioration in real time. For months, sophisticated listening devices recorded Gotti's growing frustration with his underboss. The conversations revealed a boss who had begun questioning Gravano's loyalty, criticizing his caution, wondering aloud whether his partner was still reliable. In one recorded conversation, Gotti complained to associate Frank Locascio, "Sammy thinks he knows better than everybody, always second-guessing, always being careful. Maybe he's thinking about himself more than he's thinking about us." In another recording, Gotti was more direct. "I don't know if Sammy's got the stomach for this anymore. Maybe he's going soft." These weren't casual observations. In organized crime, questioning someone's loyalty was usually the first step toward eliminating them. Gotti was essentially talking himself into viewing Gravano as a liability rather than an asset. The federal government was listening to every word. When FBI agents arrested both men on December 11, 1990, they possessed something unprecedented, evidence not just of their crimes, but of their deteriorating relationship. Federal prosecutors understood immediately that this gave them leverage they had never possessed in previous Gotti cases. They could offer each man a choice: betray the other or face the consequences of loyalty together. John Gotti's choice was immediate and absolute. He hired the best defense attorneys money could buy, maintained his innocence in all public statements, and made it clear that he would rather die in prison than cooperate with federal authorities. His reasoning was straightforward. He was John Gotti. He didn't make deals. He didn't show weakness. He certainly didn't betray partners who had stood with him through years of federal investigation. Sammy Gravano's choice was more complex. From his cell in the Metropolitan Correctional Center, he began what would become the most consequential calculation in organized crime history. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The federal government had recorded him discussing specific murders, extortion schemes, and criminal operations. Even with the best legal defense, conviction was inevitable. The only question was sentence length: life in prison or something negotiable. Gravano possessed something valuable to federal prosecutors: detailed first-hand knowledge of Gambino family operations spanning 15 years. He had been present during the planning and execution of major crimes. More importantly, he could provide the narrative context that transformed scattered evidence into coherent criminal conspiracy charges. His testimony could convict not just John Gotti, but dozens of other organized crime figures. That testimony had a price. In January 1991, Gravano's attorney approached federal prosecutors with preliminary inquiries about cooperation. The government's response was unprecedented: complete immunity from the death penalty, a recommended sentence of 5 years or less, enrollment in the Federal Witness Protection Program, financial support during testimony, and new identities for his entire family. The mathematics were stunning. Salvatore Gravano had committed 19 murders. Under normal circumstances, each murder could result in a life sentence or execution. Instead, federal prosecutors were offering him less prison time than many nonviolent drug offenders received. The message was clear: his cooperation was worth more to the government than his punishment. On March 13, 1991, Gravano signed the cooperation agreement. The document was 43 pages of detailed terms and conditions, but the essential transaction was simple: complete testimony against John Gotti and other organized crime figures in exchange for freedom after a brief prison term. 19 murders bought him 5 years. John Gotti's loyalty would buy him life without parole. The trial began in February 1992. For 9 days, Salvatore Gravano methodically dismantled the criminal empire he had helped build. He described how murders were planned and executed, how legitimate businesses were used to launder criminal proceeds, how construction contracts were obtained through intimidation. Most devastatingly, he provided detailed testimony about John Gotti's direct involvement in criminal activities, describing specific conversations where Gotti had ordered violence, approved extortion schemes, and made strategic decisions about territorial disputes. Gotti's defense team attacked Gravano's credibility relentlessly. They pointed out that he was testifying to avoid multiple life sentences, that he had admitted to 19 murders, that his cooperation was motivated entirely by self-preservation, but the jury found his testimony credible and compelling. His detailed knowledge, corroborated by FBI surveillance recordings, painted an undeniable picture of Gotti's leadership role in criminal conspiracy. On April 2, 1992, John Gotti was convicted on all charges: racketeering, murder, conspiracy, extortion, obstruction of justice. Judge Y. Leo Glasser sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, calling him the most prominent organized crime figure in American history. Gotti showed no emotion during sentencing, maintaining his dignity and silence to the end. Salvatore Gravano received exactly what federal prosecutors had promised: 5 years in prison, served in protective custody to prevent retaliation. He was released in September 1995 and disappeared into the Federal Witness Protection Program with a new name, financial support, and ongoing security protection. The disparity in their fates revealed something profound about how the federal system had learned to destroy organized crime. Traditional prosecutions focused on proving specific crimes. Modern prosecutions focused on corrupting the values that made criminal organizations possible. By making betrayal profitable and loyalty expensive, federal authorities had solved the problem that had frustrated law enforcement for generations. John Gotti died in federal prison on June 10, 2002. After serving 10 years of his life sentence, he never cooperated with authorities, never provided information about other criminal figures, never expressed regret about choosing loyalty over freedom. He maintained the principles of organized crime until his death from throat cancer at the Federal Prison Medical Facility in Springfield, Missouri. Salvatore Gravano's post-cooperation life followed a more complicated path. He eventually violated his witness protection agreement by returning to criminal activity, was arrested in Arizona in 2000 on drug trafficking charges, and received another 19-year sentence. He was released in 2017 after serving 17 years. Even accounting for both sentences, he served less total prison time than John Gotti served for refusing to cooperate. The mathematics were undeniable. Betrayal had become the rational choice for any criminal facing federal prosecution. Loyalty had become a luxury that only the wealthy or the suicidal could afford. The federal government had learned to weaponize honor itself, turning the strongest bonds in criminal organizations into their greatest vulnerabilities. The Gotti-Gravano case became the template for organized crime prosecutions nationwide. Cooperation agreements became routine rather than exceptional. Within a decade, traditional Italian-American organized crime had essentially collapsed, not because federal agents had become better investigators, but because criminals learned that loyalty was a currency that only bought suffering. John Gotti represented the end of an era in American organized crime, the last generation of criminal leaders who genuinely believed that honor was more valuable than freedom, that loyalty was more important than survival. His conviction marked the triumph of a federal strategy based on a simple insight: every man has a price, and the government was willing to pay it. Sammy Gravano proved that insight correct. 19 murders bought him 5 years in prison and eventual freedom. Absolute loyalty bought John Gotti a life sentence and death behind bars. The lesson was permanent. In modern federal prosecution, honor was the most expensive luxury any criminal could afford.